Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. The Sleeping Beauty Problem. A woman volunteers for an unusual experiment in probability and subjective credence, an experiment that will test how she should reason about her own situation when her memory has been manipulated. And the setup is as follows. On Sunday she's put to sleep, and a fair coin is flipped. If the coin lands heads, she is awakened on Monday, interviewed briefly, and then the experiment ends. But if the coin lands tails, she is awakened on Monday, interviewed, given a drug that erases her memory of the Monday awakening, put back to sleep, awakened again on Tuesday, interviewed again, and then the experiment ends. And the crucial feature is that whenever she is awakened, she cannot tell whether it is Monday or Tuesday, cannot tell whether the coin landed heads or tails. She knows only that she is awake and being interviewed. And the question posed to philosophers and decision theorists is this: when Sleeping Beauty is awakened and interviewed, what should her credence be that the coin landed heads? What probability should she assign to heads given her situation and her knowledge? The problem divides respondents into two camps, the halfers and the thirders, and each position has compelling arguments. Yet they reach opposite conclusions, creating a paradox that reveals deep tensions in how we think about probability, information, and self-locating belief. The halfers argue that Sleeping Beauty should maintain her prior credence of one half, because the coin is fair and nothing she learns upon awakening provides evidence about how it landed. She knew before the experiment that she would be awakened at least once. And being awakened is guaranteed regardless of the coin outcome, and so the awakening provides no new information, no reason to update her probability, and therefore she should stick with one half. And this reasoning seems straightforward, seems to respect the principle that probabilities should only change when new evidence is acquired, and being awakened is not new evidence because it was certain to happen. The thirders argue that Sleeping Beauty should assign credence 1/3 to heads, because there are three possible awakening situations: heads Monday, tails Monday, and tails Tuesday. And from her perspective, upon awakening, these three situations are indistinguishable. She cannot tell which one she is in, and by a principle of indifference among indistinguishable possibilities, she should assign equal probability to each, 1/3 to each. And since heads corresponds to only one of these situations, heads Monday, while tails corresponds to two, tails Monday and tails Tuesday, her credence in heads should be 1/3 and her credence in tails should be 2/3. And this reasoning seems to respect the information that if the coin landed tails, she is twice as likely to be awakened, that her current awakening is more probable under tails than under heads. And this should shift her credence toward tails. The disagreement between halfers and thirders reflects a deeper question about what credences represent and how they should be updated. Halfers tend to interpret credence as tracking objective chance, the physical probability of the coin flip, which is 1/2 and does not change based on Sleeping Beauty's subjective situation, while thirders interpret credence as tracking epistemic probability, the rational degree of belief given all available information, including self-locating information. And from this perspective, Sleeping Beauty's situation upon awakening is evidence that favours tails, because tails generates more awakenings and therefore more situations in which she finds herself awakened and uncertain. The problem becomes more vivid when decision-theoretic stakes are introduced. Suppose Sleeping Beauty is offered a bet each time she is awakened. A bet that pays if heads and costs if tails, and she must decide whether to accept. And now the question is what odds she should demand to make the bet fair, and halfers say she should demand even odds, 1-to-1, because the coin is fair, while thirders say she should demand 2-to-1 odds in favour of tails, because she is more likely to be betting in a tails scenario where she will lose. And when the bet is actually offered and payoffs are calculated, the thirder strategy performs better, winning more money on average. And this seems to vindicate the thirder position, to show that 1/3 is the correct credence for guiding decisions. Yet halfers respond that this merely shows a difference between epistemic credence and decision-making strategy, that the correct probability of heads is still 1/2, even if the correct betting strategy involves different odds. The Sleeping Beauty problem also raises questions about the reference class problem, the question of which group of situations Sleeping Beauty should consider herself a random member of. Should she think of herself as randomly selected from the set of coin flips, in which case heads and tails are equally likely, or should she think of herself as randomly selected from the set of awakening events, in which case tails is twice as likely, and different reference classes lead to different probabilities, and there is no obviously correct way to choose between them. The problem connects to issues about personal identity and indexical information, information about who or when or where you are, because Sleeping Beauty, upon awakening, does not learn any new dicto information, any new information about how the world is. She already knew that she would be awakened at least once, but she does gain new desi information. New information about which temporal slice of herself she currently is. New information about her location in time. And the question is whether this indexical information should change her credences, whether learning that you're currently experiencing an awakening provides evidence about the coin, even if you knew that you would experience at least one awakening. Some philosophers propose middle positions, arguing that different notions of probability are at play, and that the halfer and thirder answers are both correct relative to different interpretive frameworks, or that the question is underspecified and cannot be answered without further stipulations about what is being asked. But these conciliatory approaches satisfy neither halfers nor thirders, each of whom believes their answer is the uniquely correct one. The problem has spawned an enormous literature, with variants and extensions testing different aspects of the puzzle, versions with different probabilities for the coin, versions with different numbers of awakenings, versions where Sleeping Beauty is told what day it is, and each variant sharpens the intuitions or reveals new complications, and the debate shows no signs of resolution. Conferences are held, papers are written, arguments are refined, and the community remains divided. And this persistence suggests that the Sleeping Beauty problem may not have a single correct answer, may instead reveal an ambiguity or indeterminacy in the concept of rational credence, a place where our intuitions pull in different directions, and no amount of formalization fully captures what is at stake. Sleeping Beauty lies in the laboratory, awakened and interviewed, uncertain whether it is Monday or Tuesday, uncertain whether the coin landed heads or tails, and she must assign a probability, must decide what to believe. And the philosophers watching cannot agree on what she should say, cannot agree on whether her credence should be 1/2 or 1/3, and the experiment continues. The coin is flipped again and again. Sleeping Beauty is awakened and interviewed again and again, and the paradox persists, a puzzle that seems simple, a question about a coin flip and some awakenings, yet contains within it deep disagreements about probability, evidence, identity, and the nature of rational belief. And no solution has won consensus, no argument has settled the debate, and Sleeping Beauty remains caught between halfers and thirders, between two ways of understanding her situation, two ways of reasoning about uncertainty, and perhaps there is no fact of the matter, no correct answer, only different frameworks that give different results. And the choice between them reflects philosophical commitments rather than mathematical necessity, and the problem endures a touchstone in debates about probability, a puzzle that refuses to be solved, a question that generates endless discussion, yet no agreement, and Sleeping Beauty wakes and wonders, and assigns her credence, and the debate continues, without end, without resolution, a permanent fixture in the landscape of philosophical paradoxes. The Stadium Paradox. Zeno of Elea constructed another puzzle about motion, one less famous than his other paradoxes, but perhaps more perplexing, and this is the Stadium Paradox, sometimes called the moving rows paradox, a thought experiment involving 3 rows of objects moving past each other that seems to prove that half a moment equals a whole moment, that time itself is inconsistent. Imagine 3 rows of objects arranged in a stadium, each row containing the same number of objects. Let us say 4 objects in each row for simplicity, and the first row remains stationary, while the second row moves to the right and the third row moves to the left, each moving at the same speed. At the starting moment the rows are aligned, but after 1 unit of time the second row has moved 1 position to the right and the third row has moved 1 position to the left. And here is where the paradox emerges. From the perspective of the stationary first row, each moving row has passed 1 object, but from the perspective of the second row moving right, the third row moving left has passed 2 objects. Because the relative motion between the second and third rows is twice as fast as the motion of either row relative to the stationary row. Zeno argued that this leads to a contradiction, because if the smallest unit of time is the time it takes for one object to pass another, then relative to the first row, 1 unit of time has passed, but relative to the second row, 2 units of time have passed, as measured by how many objects of the third row have gone by. And so the same interval is both 1 unit and 2 units, half of itself and equal to itself, and time becomes incoherent. The paradox is more difficult to grasp than Zeno's other arguments, and even ancient commentators struggled to articulate exactly what the problem was supposed to be, and Aristotle's response was somewhat dismissive, pointing out that the speed of an object depends on the frame of reference, that there is no absolute motion, but only motion relative to other objects, and that the time it takes to pass an object in motion is different from the time it takes to pass a stationary object, and therefore there is no contradiction, merely a confusion about relative velocities. Modern physics has vindicated Aristotle's intuition through the principle of relativity, which states that the laws of physics are the same in all inertial reference frames, and that there is no privileged stationary frame. All motion is relative, and the speed at which objects pass each other depends on the observer's frame of reference. Yet some interpreters suggest that Zeno's Stadium Paradox was actually an early glimpse of the relativity of motion, an attempt to show that if motion is real, then there can be no absolute measure of speed or time, and that this was meant to support Parmenides' claim that motion is an illusion. Others argue that the paradox reveals an implicit assumption about the discrete nature of space and time, that Zeno may have been imagining space as a grid of discrete positions and time as a sequence of discrete moments, and that the paradox arises from trying to reconcile continuous motion with discrete structure, a tension that would not be fully addressed until the development of calculus and later quantum mechanics. The paradox also touches on the concept of relative velocity, the idea that the speed of one object relative to another is the sum of their individual speeds if they are moving in opposite directions, and that this is perfectly consistent even though it means different observers measure different relative speeds. In a sense, the Stadium Paradox is less about motion itself and more about the consistency of measurement, the question of whether time and space have absolute units, or whether all measurements are relative to the observer. And this question would not be fully answered until Einstein's theories of special and general relativity in the 20th century, which showed that time itself is not absolute, but depends on the relative motion and gravitational fields of the observer. Zeno's Stadium sits quietly in the history of philosophy, overshadowed by his more famous paradoxes, yet it contains within it the seeds of ideas that would take 2,000 years to fully develop. The relativity of motion, the frame dependence of measurement, the question of whether space and time are discrete or continuous, and the paradox remains a reminder that even the simplest scenarios, 3 rows of objects moving past each other, can conceal deep questions about the nature of reality, questions that our intuitions cannot easily answer, questions that require centuries of thought and mathematics to even begin to unravel. The symbol grounding problem. Why computers never know what words really mean. A computer system is given a dictionary, a complete dictionary that defines every word in terms of other words, and the system can look up any word, follow the chains of definitions, process the relationships between symbols, and the system appears to understand language, can answer questions by manipulating symbols according to rules, can translate between languages by mapping symbols to symbols, can even generate coherent text by following patterns learned from training data. And yet philosopher Stephen Harnad asks a crucial question. Does the system understand what any symbol means? Does it know what the words refer to? Or is it merely shuffling meaningless tokens according to syntactic rules? And this is the symbol grounding problem. The question of how symbols, whether in computers or in minds, acquire meaning, how they connect to the world, how they come to be about something rather than being mere formal marks. And the problem challenges purely symbolic theories of cognition, challenges the idea that thinking is symbol manipulation, and points to the need for grounding, for connecting symbols to non-symbolic experiences, to perceptions and actions, to interactions with the world that give symbols their meaning. Imagine looking up the word zebra in the dictionary, and the dictionary says a zebra is a striped equine mammal, and you look up striped and find marked with parallel bands, and you look up equine and find relating to horses, and you look up mammal and find warm-blooded vertebrate animal, and you can continue this process indefinitely, following chains of definitions, symbol to symbol to symbol, and if you have never seen a zebra, never encountered stripes or horses or animals, then all these definitions are empty, are just more words whose meanings you do not grasp, and the whole dictionary becomes a closed system of symbols referring to other symbols with no connection to reality. And this is the situation of a purely symbolic computer system. It has access to definitions, to relationships between symbols, but it has no grounding, no connection to the real zebras and stripes and horses that the symbols are supposed to be about. The symbol grounding problem challenges strong AI, the claim that implementing the right program, manipulating symbols according to the right rules, is sufficient for understanding, is sufficient for genuine cognition, and Harnad argues that symbol manipulation alone is not enough, that understanding requires grounding, requires that at least some symbols be connected to non-symbolic experiences, to sensory inputs and motor outputs, to perceptions of the world and actions in the world, and these grounded symbols can then give meaning to other symbols through their relationships. And a hybrid system, with both grounded and symbolic components, can achieve genuine understanding, but a purely symbolic system cannot. Remains forever trapped in a web of meaningless symbols, playing symbol games without comprehension. Visualize 2 systems. One is a person who has seen zebras, has perceived their stripes, has distinguished them from horses, and when this person uses the word zebra, it is grounded in these experiences, refers to real animals encountered in the world. And the other system is a computer that has only manipulated symbols, has processed text containing the word zebra, has learned statistical patterns, but has never perceived a zebra, never interacted with one. And when this system uses zebra, it is ungrounded, refers to nothing beyond other symbols. And Harnad's claim is that these 2 uses are fundamentally different, that the person understands what zebra means, and the computer does not. And the difference is grounding, is connection to non-symbolic reality. The symbol grounding problem connects to arguments in philosophy of mind like Searle's Chinese room, which argues that syntax is not sufficient for semantics, that manipulating symbols, according to rules, does not produce understanding, and both arguments challenge computational theories of mind, challenge the idea that cognition is just symbol manipulation, and both point to the need for something more, something beyond symbols. Though they disagree about what that something is, Searle appeals to intrinsic intentionality and consciousness, while Harnad appeals to sensorimotor grounding and interaction with the world. One response to the symbol grounding problem accepts it and argues that AI systems need embodiment, need sensors and actuators, need to interact with the physical world, and recent developments in robotics and embodied AI pursue this approach, creating systems that learn through perception and action, that ground their symbols in sensory experience. And these systems can associate words with visual features, can learn that zebra refers to things with certain visible properties, and this grounding, even if limited compared to human grounding, provides a foundation for meaning that purely symbolic systems lack. Another response challenges the problem, argues that grounding is not necessary for meaning, that symbol systems can have meaningful representations through their functional roles, through how symbols are used in inference and reasoning, and meaning is holistic, depends on the entire network of symbols and their relationships. And a sufficiently complex symbolic system can have meaningful representations even without grounding in perception and action. And this response defends computationalism, defends the idea that cognition is symbol manipulation, and denies that something extra, something beyond symbols, is needed for genuine understanding. A third response distinguishes between different kinds of meaning, between dictionary meaning, which can be captured symbolically, and grounded meaning, which requires connection to experience, and argues that both kinds exist. Both are legitimate, and purely symbolic systems can have dictionary meaning even if they lack grounded meaning, and for many purposes dictionary meaning is sufficient, is all that is needed for tasks like translation or information retrieval, and so the symbol grounding problem, while real, is less threatening than it appears, shows limits on what purely symbolic systems can do, but does not show that such systems are meaningless or useless. The symbol grounding problem also has implications for language learning, for understanding how children acquire meaning, because children do not learn language from dictionaries, do not master symbols by relating them to other symbols, but learn by associating words with experiences, by hearing zebra while seeing zebras, by using words in context, by grounding language in perception and action. And this grounding happens early, provides a foundation of basic concepts, and more abstract concepts are built on this foundation through symbol-symbol relationships. And so human language combines grounding and symbolic structure, uses both perceptual and abstract meaning, and neither alone is sufficient. The computer processes text, generates responses, manipulates symbols with impressive fluency, and yet the question remains whether it understands anything, whether its symbols mean anything beyond their formal relationships, and Harnad's symbol grounding problem suggests not, suggests that without grounding in non-symbolic experience, the symbols are empty, are syntactic objects without semantic content. And the problem persists as a challenge to AI, as a question about what would be needed for machines to genuinely understand, whether symbol manipulation supplemented with machine learning is enough, or whether something else, something like embodied interaction with the world, is necessary. And the problem remains unresolved, remains debated, remains a permanent feature of discussions about AI and cognition, about meaning and understanding, about the relationship between symbols and what they represent. And the symbol grounding problem endures as a reminder that meaning is not just a matter of relationships between symbols, but requires connection to a non-symbolic ground, requires that symbols hook onto the world, requires that language touch reality, And whether computers can achieve this grounding, whether they can move beyond symbol manipulation to genuine understanding, remains one of the central questions in artificial intelligence and philosophy of mind. The transfer principle. Paradox when powerlessness spreads like a virus. A philosopher constructs a principle about power and control, about what things are and are not within our ability to affect. And the principle seems obviously true, seems like basic logic about how powerlessness transfers. And the principle says that if you have no power over one fact and that fact entails another fact and you have no power over the entailment itself, then you have no power over the second fact either. Powerlessness transfers across entailment, spreads from premises to conclusions, and this transfer principle is the backbone of the consequence argument for incompatibilism, is what allows the argument to move from our powerlessness over the past and laws to our powerlessness over the present. And yet, compatibilists deny this principle, argue that it is false, that powerlessness does not always transfer, that you can have power over a fact even when that fact is entailed by facts you have no power over. And this creates a paradox, because the transfer principle seems undeniable, seems like it must be true, and yet if it is true, then compatibilism is false. And if it is false, then the consequence argument fails, and both options are difficult. Both require accepting something counterintuitive, and this is the transfer principle paradox. The puzzle about whether powerlessness transfers, whether the principle is a logical truth or contains hidden errors, and the paradox sits at the heart of the free will debate, determines whether incompatibilism or compatibilism wins. And no consensus has emerged. Philosophers remain divided, and the transfer principle stands as one of the most contested principles in metaphysics. A principle that seems obvious but whose truth determines fundamental questions about freedom and determinism. Imagine the transfer principle applied to a simple case. You have no power over the fact that there was a Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago, and the Big Bang plus the laws of physics entail the current state of the universe, including your current action, and you have no power over the laws of physics, and you have no power over the entailment itself, over the fact that the Big Bang and laws entail your action. And so by the transfer principle, you have no power over your current action. Your action is not up to you, is not within your control, and if you have no power over your action, then you are not free with respect to that action. And this reasoning seems airtight, seems like it must be correct, and yet compatibilists deny the conclusion, deny that determinism eliminates power, and so they must deny the transfer principle, must argue that power does not transfer in the way the principle claims. The transfer principle can be stated formally using symbols. If no one has power over P, and P entails Q, and no one has power over the entailment from P to Q, then no one has power over Q. And this seems like a valid rule of inference about power, seems like it should be uncontroversial, and yet compatibilists argue it contains a subtle error, a conflation of different senses of power, or an invalid inference structure, or an equivocation on what it means to have power over something. And these objections attempt to show that the transfer principle, despite its intuitive appeal, is actually false, and powerlessness does not always transfer. Visualize powerlessness as a property that might or might not spread from one fact to another, like a contagion that sometimes transmits and sometimes does not. And the transfer principle says the contagion always spreads across entailment, always passes from premises to conclusions. But compatibilists say transmission is blocked under certain conditions, say that the link between premises and conclusions does not preserve powerlessness in the way incompatibilists claim. And this disagreement is fundamental, shapes the entire free will debate, determines which arguments succeed and which fail. One compatibilist response to the transfer principle distinguishes between two kinds of power: the power to make something the case and the power to have made something the case, and argues that the transfer principle conflates these, that while you lack the power to have made the past different, You do have the power to make the present what it is, and the presence being entailed by the past does not eliminate your power over the present, does not make your action not up to you, and the transfer principle fails because it moves illegitimately from past-directed power to present-directed power, treats them as the same when they are different. And once the distinction is recognized, the principle's apparent validity disappears. Another compatibilist response argues that the transfer principle uses the wrong notion of power, defines power in terms of ability to falsify facts, ability to make false things that are true. And this notion of power is inappropriate, is not what matters for freedom. And the right notion of power is counterfactual power. Power such that, if you had chosen differently, then different things would have happened. And counterfactual power is not governed by the transfer principle, does not transfer from premises to conclusions in the way the principle claims. And so the principle fails as a constraint on freedom, fails to show that determinism eliminates the kind of power needed for responsibility. A third compatibilist response accepts the transfer principle for some inferences but denies it for others, argues that the principle is valid in some contexts but invalid in others, and the contexts where it fails are precisely the contexts involving agency and choice, contexts where the agent is part of the causal chain between past and present, and in these contexts the agent's involvement blocks transfer, prevents powerlessness from spreading from past to present, and the transfer principle is not a universal logical truth, but a context-sensitive inference rule that admits exceptions. Incompatibilists defend the transfer principle, argue that compatibilist objections are sophistical, involve verbal tricks and redefinitions that obscure the real issue, and the transfer principle is valid, is a genuine constraint on power. And if you have no power over the past and laws, then you have no power over anything entailed by them. And this includes your present actions. And so determinism eliminates power, eliminates control, and compatibilism is false. And the transfer principle stands as a cornerstone of incompatibilist arguments, a principle that compatibilists cannot successfully reject without abandoning common sense about how powerlessness works. The debate over the transfer principle has generated enormous technical literature, philosophers constructing formal versions of the principle in modal logic, testing it against various cases, proposing refinements and modifications, and no consensus has emerged, and the debate reveals deep disagreements about the nature of power, about what it means to have something be up to you, about whether power is a metaphysical notion or an epistemic notion. And these disagreements shape views about free will, about whether compatibilism or incompatibilism is correct. The transfer principle also connects to debates about counterfactuals, about what would have happened if things had been different, because compatibilists often appeal to counterfactuals to explain power, say that you have power over your action because if you'd chosen differently, you would have acted differently. And incompatibilists respond that these counterfactuals do not show genuine power. Because the antecedent is impossible given determinism, you could not have chosen differently given the past and laws, and so the counterfactuals are vacuous, and compatibilist power is illusory, and the transfer principle makes this explicit, shows that compatibilist power is not real power because it is entailed by facts you have no power over. The principle stands at the centre of the free will debate, determines whether the consequence argument succeeds, whether incompatibilism is established, whether determinism is compatible with freedom, and both sides have powerful arguments. Both can make their case seem compelling, and the stalemate persists, and perhaps this reflects something deep. Perhaps the transfer principle is one of those principles where our intuitions are divided, where different ways of thinking about power lead to different judgments, and no argument can establish the principle or refute it definitively, and we are left with competing perspectives, incompatibilist and compatibilist, each coherent internally, each unsatisfying to those who adopt the other, and the transfer principle paradox endures, a principle that seems both obviously true and demonstrably false, depending on how you think about power and control. And the paradox remains unresolved, remains central to debates about free will, and powerlessness spreads or does not spread, transfers or is blocked, and which answer is correct determines whether we are free, and the transfer principle stands, controversial and crucial, a principle whose truth or falsity shapes fundamental metaphysical questions about agency and determinism. The voting paradox, when adding voters changes winners impossibly. An election occurs, 3 candidates compete, and voters rank the candidates according to their preferences, and the votes are counted, and candidate A wins, receives the most support, is the clear winner. And then more voters arrive, more ballots are cast, and these new voters all rank candidate A first, all prefer A to the other candidates, all support the winner, and the votes are recounted with the additional ballots, and candidate A loses, is no longer the winner, is defeated by candidate B or C. And this seems impossible, seems to violate basic logic, seems to contradict the meaning of support. Because how can receiving additional support cause a candidate to lose? How can gaining voters result in defeat? And yet this can happen under certain voting systems, under rank choice or instant runoff systems, where voters rank candidates and losers are eliminated in rounds. And the elimination order can change when new voters are added, can cause candidates who would have been eliminated early to survive, and candidates who would have won to be eliminated. And this is the voting paradox, the demonstration that voting systems can produce inconsistent results, can violate monotonicity, can make winners lose when they gain support. And the paradox reveals that translating individual preferences into collective choices is more complex than it seems, that no voting system is perfect, that all systems have problematic properties. And the voting paradox is one of many paradoxes that arise in social choice theory, in the study of how groups make decisions, and these paradoxes show that democratic decision-making faces inherent difficulties, faces impossibilities proven by mathematical theorems. And the voting paradox remains a challenge for democratic theory, forces recognition that institutional design matters, that different voting systems produce different outcomes from the same preferences, and that choosing a voting system requires trade-offs, requires accepting some problems to avoid others. Imagine a specific example with instant runoff voting. 3 candidates A, B, C, and initially 5 voters with preferences. 2 voters prefer A, then B, then C. 2 voters prefer B, then C, then A. And 1 voter prefers C, then B, then A. And in the first round, A receives 2 first-place votes. B receives 2, C receives 1, so C is eliminated for having the fewest. And C's vote transfers to B, and B wins with 3 votes to A's 2. And now suppose 2 additional voters arrive, both ranking A first, ranking A, then C, then B, and now there are 7 voters. 4 prefer A first, and in the first round A receives 4 first-place votes. B receives 2, C receives 1, so C is eliminated again, and C's vote plus the 2 new votes that ranked C second all transfer to B. Wait, let me recalculate. The 2 new voters ranked C second, so their votes would transfer to C if A were eliminated, but A has most first-place votes, so instead B is eliminated for having fewest, and B's votes transfer based on second preferences. The original 2 B voters had C second, so those transfer to C, and now C has 3 votes to A's 4. And A wins, so actually this example shows A winning both times. Let me construct a different example. Consider instead 3 candidates and a scenario where initial votes create a situation where candidate B wins after C is eliminated, and C's supporters transfer to B. But when new voters arrive supporting A, this changes the elimination order such that B is eliminated first, and B's supporters transfer to C, and C wins, defeating A despite A gaining support. And constructing specific examples requires careful attention to transfer patterns, to how second and third preferences interact with elimination orders, and the paradox is real, has been documented, has been proven possible under instant runoff and other systems. And the mathematical possibility demonstrates that monotonicity, the principle that gaining support cannot hurt a candidate, is not guaranteed by all voting systems, is violated by some systems, and this violation is paradoxical, is counterintuitive, seems to violate the meaning of winning. The voting paradox connects to Arrow's impossibility theorem, which proves that no voting system can simultaneously satisfy a set of seemingly reasonable criteria, including monotonicity, independence of irrelevant alternatives, Pareto efficiency, and non-dictatorship, and the voting paradox is one manifestation of this impossibility, is one way that voting systems fail to satisfy all desirable properties. And Arrow's theorem shows that the paradox is not a defect of particular voting systems, but is an inherent feature of aggregating preferences. It is an unavoidable trade-off, and different voting systems make different trade-offs, prioritize different properties, and the paradox shows that monotonicity is one property that some systems sacrifice. And choosing a voting system requires deciding which properties are most important, which failures are most acceptable. Visualize the voting paradox as revealing path dependence, where the outcome depends not just on preferences but on the order in which candidates are eliminated, on the sequence of decisions, and adding voters changes. This sequence changes which candidates survive to later rounds. And this path dependence creates opportunities for paradoxes, creates situations where gaining support can hurt because it changes the path, changes who is eliminated when. And this shows that voting outcomes are not simply determined by preferences, but are mediated by procedures, by the specific rules used to aggregate preferences, and different rules produce different outcomes. One response to the voting paradox is to abandon instant runoff voting, to use systems that do not exhibit non-monotonicity and plurality voting, where the candidate with most first-place votes wins without elimination rounds, satisfies monotonicity. Gaining votes always helps under plurality, but plurality has other problems, has spoiler effects, can elect candidates opposed by majorities, and so while plurality avoids the voting paradox, it faces different paradoxes, different failures, and no system is paradox-free, and the choice is between different sets of problems. Another response is to accept that monotonicity, violations are rare, are unlikely in practice, require specific configurations of preferences, and while the voting paradox is possible, it is improbable, and instant runoff voting performs well on average. Despite theoretical problems, and empirical studies of actual elections using instant runoff find few, if any, cases of monotonicity violations, find that the paradox is more theoretical than practical, and this response prioritizes actual performance over theoretical properties, accepts that systems can be good enough even if not perfect. An instant runoff may be good enough despite the voting paradox. A third response develops approval voting or score voting systems, where voters can express intensity of preference, can give multiple candidates approval or give candidates numerical scores. And these systems have different properties, avoid some paradoxes while potentially creating others. And approval voting satisfies monotonicity. Gaining approval always helps, but approval voting faces strategic voting problems. Voters must decide which candidates to approve. An optimal strategy depends on expectations about others' votes, and this strategic complexity is a different kind of problem, and no system eliminates all difficulties. The voting paradox also raises questions about the meaning of winning, about what it means for a candidate to have majority support, and the paradox shows that winning is system relative, is defined by the voting rules, and different rules define winning differently. And a candidate can be a winner under one system and a loser under another, even with the same preferences. And this challenges the idea that elections reveal a determinate will of the people, suggests that collective will is constructed by voting procedures rather than simply discovered, and different procedures construct different collective wills. And this has implications for democratic legitimacy, for understanding what elections achieve. And some argue that the paradox undermines electoral legitimacy, shows that election outcomes are arbitrary, are dependent on rules rather than reflecting genuine popular preferences, while others argue that the paradox shows only that rule choice matters, that democracy requires choosing rules wisely, but that elections can still be legitimate, even if different rules would produce different outcomes. The election is held, votes are counted, and candidate A wins, and more votes arrive supporting A, and votes are recounted, and A loses, and the paradox emerges, impossible but real, proven but counterintuitive, and the voting paradox stands as one of many paradoxes. In social choice theory, stands as evidence that aggregating preferences is complex, is not simply a matter of counting, but involves trade-offs, involves accepting some problems to avoid others. And the paradox shows that no voting system is perfect, that Arrow's impossibility theorem is not merely theoretical, but has practical manifestations, and the voting paradox remains relevant for democratic design, for choosing electoral systems, for understanding the limits of voting, and the paradox endures. Berry's paradox. Language allows us to describe numbers in various ways, and some descriptions are short while others are long, and this leads to a curious question posed by G.G. Berry and later popularized by Bertrand Russell. What is the smallest positive integer that cannot be described in fewer than 20 words? And the moment this question is asked, the paradox appears. The phrase itself, the smallest positive integer that cannot be described in fewer than 20 words, is a description, and counting the words reveals that it contains only 13 words, which means it describes a number in fewer than 20 words. But the number it describes is supposed to be the smallest number that cannot be described in fewer than 20 words, and so a contradiction emerges. If such a number exists, then it has just been described in 13 words, which means it can be described in fewer than 20 words, which means it does not meet the criteria of being a number that cannot be described in fewer than 20 words, and therefore it cannot be the number the phrase claims it is. And yet the phrase clearly picks out some specific number, and that number must exist somewhere in the infinite sequence of integers. The paradox reveals a deep tension between language and mathematics, between the finite tools of description and the infinite objects those tools attempt to capture, and it suggests that not all mathematical objects can be uniquely specified using the resources of natural language. Berry's paradox is closely related to Richard's paradox and other semantic paradoxes that arise when language tries to refer to itself or to its own limitations, and it played a role in early 20th century debates about the foundations of mathematics, particularly in discussions about definability and the limits of formal systems. Some logicians argue that the phrase "the smallest positive integer that cannot be described in fewer than 20 words" is simply ill-formed, that it does not successfully refer to any number at all because its definition is self-contradictory, much like the set of all sets that do not contain themselves fails to be a coherent set. Others suggest that the paradox arises from an ambiguity in what it means to describe a number, that descriptions exist within formal languages with specific rules, and that mixing informal natural language with formal mathematical definitions creates confusion. Alfred Tarski's work on truth and definability offers one way to resolve the paradox by distinguishing between levels of language, separating the language used to describe numbers from the meta-language used to describe descriptions, and showing that paradoxes like Berry's emerge when these levels are improperly conflated. The paradox also touches on questions about computability and algorithmic complexity, because if a number cannot be described in fewer than a certain number of words, it might also be incomputable or irreducibly complex, existing beyond the reach of any finite algorithm. Berry's paradox lingers as a reminder that language, for all its power, is not unlimited, that there are numbers and truths that slip through the gaps in description, that the map is not the territory and can never fully be, and that even something as seemingly concrete as a positive integer can become strange and elusive when definitions turn inward and try to grasp themselves. Zuboff's paradox, a thought experiment in personal identity, asks us to imagine a machine that can instantly create a perfect duplicate of a person, atom by atom, molecule by molecule, and the duplicate is placed in a different location, perhaps on Mars while the original remains on Earth, and both individuals emerge from the process with all the same memories, the same personality, the same sense of being the person who entered the machine. And now the question arises, which one is the real person? Which one continues the original stream of consciousness? And Zuboff's paradox, presented by Arnold Zuboff, pushes this scenario further by asking what happens if the duplication process creates not just one copy, but many copies, perhaps millions, all scattered across the universe, all emerging simultaneously with the same memories and the same conviction that they are the original person. And the paradox is that if one copy preserves personal identity, then it seems that all copies should preserve it. But if all copies are the original person, then identity has become plural. One person has become many. And this seems to violate the transitivity and uniqueness of identity. The principle that identity is a one-to-one relation, that if A is identical to B and A is identical to C, then B must be identical to C. But if millions of copies all claim to be the original person and none has a privileged status, then they cannot all be numerically identical to each other. They are distinct individuals occupying different locations. And so, identity seems to have been destroyed or multiplied in ways that make no sense. The paradox challenges the intuition that psychological continuity is sufficient for personal identity. The view associated with John Locke and Derek Parfit that what makes a future person the same person as a present person is the continuity of memories, personality, beliefs, desires, and other psychological characteristics. And this view seems plausible when considering ordinary cases of survival through time. The person who wakes up tomorrow is the same person who went to sleep tonight, because there is psychological continuity, but the duplication case shows that psychological continuity cannot be sufficient for identity because identity is one-to-one, while psychological continuity can be one-to-many. Multiple future individuals can all be psychologically continuous with a single past individual, and if we say that only one of them is the original person, then we need a criterion to distinguish that one from the others. And no such criterion seems available if all the copies are physically and psychologically identical. Zuboff's contribution is to emphasize the symmetry of the situation. When there are multiple copies and no physical or psychological differences between them, there is no non-arbitrary way to select one as the original, and the others as mere copies, and if we are forced to say that none of them is the original, that personal identity was destroyed by the duplication process, then we must accept that identity is incompatible with duplication, that what matters for survival is not just psychological continuity, but also the absence of competitors, the requirement that there be, at most, one future individual who is psychologically continuous with the present individual. And this requirement seems strange, seems to make identity depend on what happens to other people, on whether duplicates exist rather than on intrinsic facts about the individual's own physical and psychological continuity. The paradox connects to debates about what matters in survival. Parfit argued that identity is not what matters, that what we care about when we care about survival is not numerical identity, but psychological connectedness and continuity. And if these can be preserved and even multiplied, then we should regard that as a good thing, as a kind of proliferation of what matters, rather than a loss of identity. And Parfit bit the bullet, accepting that in duplication cases, the original person does not survive as a single individual, but survives in a broader sense as multiple individuals, each with equal claim to being a continuation of the original. And this view dissolves the paradox by rejecting the assumption that survival requires identity, but it strikes many people as counterintuitive, as a refusal to take seriously the distinctness of persons. The fact that I am one person, not many, and that survival means that I, this particular individual, continue to exist. Not that some psychologically similar individuals exist. Others have proposed that identity in duplication cases is vague or indeterminate, that there is no fact of the matter about which copy, if any, is the original. That identity admits of degrees or borderline cases. And this indeterminacy is not a sign of ignorance, but a feature of the metaphysics, a reflection of the fact that identity is a coarse-grained concept that breaks down in cases involving fission or duplication. And while this response accommodates the intuition that duplication creates a puzzle, it does so by accepting that some questions about identity have no determinate answers. And this itself is a controversial metaphysical commitment. Still others distinguish between survival and identity, arguing that survival is a looser relation than identity, that survival can occur without identity if there is sufficient continuity and connectedness, and that in duplication cases, all the copies survive, even though none is identical to the original. And this view preserves the one-to-one nature of identity, while allowing that what we care about, survival, can be a one-to-many relation, and it provides a framework for thinking about duplication that does not force us to choose between denying continuity matters or accepting the multiplication of identity. Zuboff's paradox also has implications for practical ethics, for questions about the permissibility of creating duplicates, about whether duplicating a person harms them or benefits them or does neither, about whether the duplicates have the same rights and responsibilities as the original, and about how to distribute resources or assign credit and blame when multiple individuals all have equal claim to being the continuation of a single person. And these questions have no obvious answers. They require rethinking fundamental assumptions about personhood, autonomy, and moral status. The duplication machine hums. The original person steps inside, and moments later, millions of copies emerge across the universe, each one waking with the conviction that they are the person who entered the machine, each one feeling the continuity of consciousness, the persistence of memory, the seamless transition from before to after. And yet, something has changed. Identity has fractured or multiplied or disappeared, and the paradox asks what has happened, what it means to survive when survival takes this form, and the answers do not come easily. They require choosing between intuitions that cannot all be preserved, between the importance of identity and the importance of continuity, between the uniqueness of persons and the possibility of multiplication. And Zuboff's paradox remains a powerful challenge to theories of personal identity, a thought experiment that exposes tensions and forces choices, and it endures as a puzzle that has no consensus solution, no answer that satisfies all intuitions, only a set of options, each with costs, each requiring the abandonment of something we thought was certain, and the copies live their lives, scattered across space, each believing themselves to be the original, and perhaps they are, or perhaps none of them are, or perhaps the question has no answer, and the paradox persists, unresolved, a permanent feature of the landscape of personal identity, a reminder that who we are, what it means to survive, what it means to be the same person over time, are questions that remain open, that resist final answers, and that become stranger and more perplexing the more carefully we examine them. Epimenides' paradox, A poet from Crete named Epimenides once declared that all Cretans are liars, and this statement, simple as it seems, has echoed through the centuries as one of the earliest recorded paradoxes, a puzzle that predates even the formal study of logic, and yet contains within it the seeds of contradictions that still trouble philosophers today. If Epimenides himself is a Cretan and he claims that all Cretans are liars, then his statement must be a lie. But if his statement is a lie, then not all Cretans are liars, which means some Cretans tell the truth, which could include Epimenides himself, which means his statement might be true after all, which means all Cretans are liars, which means his statement is a lie, and the cycle begins again. The paradox is not quite as airtight as the liar paradox that would emerge later, because calling someone a liar does not mean they always lie, only that they lie sometimes. And so there remains a sliver of logical escape, a possibility that Epimenides is telling the truth on this one occasion while still being a liar in general, or that his statement is partially true and partially false, depending on how it is interpreted. St. Paul referenced the paradox in his letter to Titus, quoting Epimenides and adding that the statement is true, seemingly unaware or unconcerned with the logical contradiction embedded in his endorsement. And this has led to centuries of theological and philosophical debate about what Paul intended and whether Scripture itself contains a paradox. The ancient Greeks recognized the puzzle, but lacked the formal tools to fully analyze it, treating it more as a rhetorical curiosity than a serious threat to logic. And it was not until the development of modern symbolic logic that the deeper implications became clear. The paradox belongs to a family of self-referential statements that collapse under their own weight, and Bertrand Russell would later use variations of this structure to reveal cracks in the foundation of mathematics, proving that not all sets can be safely defined, that not all statements can be assigned a truth value without contradiction. Some philosophers argue that the Epimenides paradox is weaker than its descendants because it depends on empirical facts about Cretans rather than purely logical structure, and that if we simply reject the premise that all Cretans are liars, the paradox dissolves, unlike the pure liar paradox which creates contradiction through its form alone. Others see it as an early recognition that language can turn against itself, that statements about truth and falsehood require careful handling, that self-reference introduces dangers that must be acknowledged and navigated. The paradox also raises questions about identity and generalization, about what it means to make sweeping claims about groups of people, and whether such claims can ever be fully coherent when the speaker is part of the group being described. Epimenides stands at the origin of a long tradition of logical puzzles, his words reverberating through time. A poet who may not have fully understood what he had unleashed, but who nevertheless gave voice to one of the fundamental tensions in human thought, the way that truth can fold back on itself and become strange, unstable, uncertain. Goodman's Grue paradox. When emeralds turn blue at midnight, a philosopher invents a new colour term, grue, and grue is defined as follows. An object is grue if it is observed before time t and is green, or if it is not observed before time t and is blue, where t is some future date, perhaps January 1st of next year. And this definition is strange, is artificial, combines observation and time in a way that ordinary colour terms do not. But the definition is precise, is perfectly clear. And now the philosopher considers emeralds and notes that all emeralds observed so far have been green. And these observations support the hypothesis all emeralds are green. And the same observations also support the hypothesis all emeralds are grue because all observed emeralds satisfy both descriptions. They are green, which means they are grue up to time t, and both hypotheses are equally well supported by the evidence. Both fit all observations perfectly, and yet the two hypotheses make different predictions about the future. The first predicts that emeralds examined after time t will be green. The second predicts they will be blue. And so we have two hypotheses, equally supported by evidence, making opposite predictions. And the question is, which hypothesis should we believe? Which generalization should we project into the future? And Nelson Goodman poses this as a problem about projectability, about which predicates can legitimately be used in inductive inferences. And this is the GRU paradox, also called Goodman's new riddle of induction, a puzzle that shows that not all evidence-supported hypotheses are equal, that some predicates are projectable and others are not, and the challenge is to explain what makes green projectable and GRU not, what distinguishes legitimate from illegitimate generalizations. Imagine living in a world where emeralds are GRU, where all emeralds observed before time t are green, but all emeralds examined after time t are blue. And from the perspective of someone before time t, this is indistinguishable from a world where emeralds are simply green. All observations are the same, and yet the two worlds are radically different, will diverge dramatically after time t. And the puzzle is that evidence accumulated before t does not distinguish between these possibilities, does not tell us which world we inhabit, and so induction alone cannot determine which hypothesis to accept, cannot tell us whether emeralds are green or GRU. And this reveals that induction requires more than just fitting evidence, requires principles about which predicates are projectable, which generalizations are legitimate. And these principles cannot themselves be justified inductively without circularity. Visualize the timeline with time t marking a boundary, and on one side of the boundary, all observed emeralds are green. And the question is what happens after the boundary. Do emeralds remain green, or do they become blue? And the hypothesis, all emeralds are GRU, says they switch colours. But this switching is built into the definition of GRU, is a feature of how the predicate is defined rather than a feature of emeralds themselves. And this reveals something important, that the GRU hypothesis is gerrymandered, is artificially constructed to fit past observations while making a different prediction about the future. And our intuition is that such gerrymandered hypotheses should not be projected, should not be taken seriously, but explaining why requires articulating a principle that distinguishes natural from gerrymandered predicates. Goodman's own solution appeals to entrenchment, argues that green is projectable because it has been used successfully in many past inductions, has become entrenched in our language and our theories, while GRU is a newcomer, is defined artificially, has no history of successful projection, and so we should prefer green over GRU, not for any logical reason, but for pragmatic reasons, because green has proven its worth. And this solution ties projectability to linguistic and scientific practice, makes it a matter of history rather than logic. And some find this unsatisfying, find it too relativistic. But Goodman argues that there is no deeper justification available, that entrenchment is as good as justification gets for inductive inference. Another response argues that GRU is not a genuine predicate, is not natural, because it is defined in terms of observation and time, includes reference to specific moments and observers, and genuine properties should be observer-independent, should not change based on when or whether they are observed. And green is natural in this sense, refers to a real property that objects have regardless of observation, while GRU is artificial, is defined through disjunction and reference to observation, and so only natural predicates are projectable. And this solution requires explaining what makes a predicate natural, what distinguishes genuine properties from artificial constructions. And this leads to metaphysical questions about the nature of properties, about whether naturalness is objective or conventional. A third response from a Bayesian perspective argues that GRU hypotheses are less probable than green hypotheses given reasonable priors, because GRU hypotheses postulate discontinuities, postulate that properties change suddenly at arbitrary times, and such discontinuities require explanation, require reasons, And in the absence of such reasons, we should assign low prior probability to GRU hypotheses. And so while GRU fits the evidence as well as green, GRU is less probable overall because of its lower prior, and this solution appeals to simplicity and parsimony, treats continuous properties as more probable than discontinuous ones, and explains projectability in terms of prior probabilities rather than entrenchment or naturalness. The GRU paradox also reveals that the problem of induction is deeper than Hume recognized, because Hume worried about justifying any inductive inference, about showing that the future will resemble the past. But even if we accept induction, we face Goodman's problem. We must choose which respects the future will resemble the past, must decide which predicates to project, and different choices lead to different predictions. And there is no algorithm, no mechanical procedure that tells us which predicates are projectable, which generalizations are legitimate. And so induction requires judgment, requires background knowledge, requires engagement with the actual practice of science rather than pure logical analysis. The paradox extends beyond emeralds and colours to any inductive inference, to all attempts to generalize from observed to unobserved cases, because for any pattern we observe, for any regularity we find, there are infinite GRU-like predicates that fit the pattern up to now, but diverge in the future, and choosing between these predicates cannot be done on evidential grounds alone, requires additional principles, requires distinguishing projectable from non-projectable predicates. And every scientific theory makes such choices, implicitly assumes that certain predicates are natural and others artificial. And Goodman's paradox makes these assumptions explicit, forces recognition that induction is not just about fitting evidence, but about choosing the right vocabulary, the right predicates, the right way of carving up the world. The clock approaches time t, and emeralds remain green, as they always have been, and the GRU hypothesis is refuted, is shown to have been wrong. But before time t, the evidence supported GRU as much as green, and this shows that evidence alone was insufficient, that something beyond evidence guided our preference for green, our confidence that emeralds would remain green rather than turning blue, and that something is what Goodman's paradox investigates, what it challenges, used to articulate, and the paradox remains not fully resolved, not answered by any single theory that satisfies everyone, but persistent as a challenge to theories of induction, a test case for accounts of scientific reasoning, and a reminder that generalizing from experience requires more than logic, requires substantive assumptions about the world, about which properties are real and which are artificial, about which patterns will continue and which will break. And these assumptions cannot be justified inductively without circularity, cannot be proven logically without begging the question. And so induction rests ultimately on judgment, on practices that have proven successful, on entrenchment or naturalness or simplicity. And Goodman's GRU paradox reveals this foundation, exposes the principles we rely on but cannot fully justify. And the paradox endures as one of the most important problems in philosophy of science. Laplace's demon, the mind that knows everything that will ever happen. A supremely intelligent being, a vast intellect that knows the position and velocity of every particle in the universe at a single instant, stands outside time and space. And this being, this demon, as Pierre-Simon Laplace called it in 1814, possesses the complete laws of physics, the equations that govern how particles interact and move, and with this information, the precise state of every atom and the exact rules of motion. The demon can calculate the future, can determine with perfect accuracy where every particle will be at any future time, can predict every event, every thought, every decision, every outcome, from the fall of a raindrop to the rise of civilizations, from the collision of atoms to the death of stars. And in principle, the demon could also calculate the past, could trace every particle's trajectory backward to determine exactly how the present arose from previous states. And so this demon, given sufficient computational power, could know everything that has happened and everything that will happen. The entire history of the universe, past and future, encoded in a single snapshot of the present. And this is Laplace's demon, a thought experiment about determinism, about whether the universe is a clockwork mechanism, where the future is entirely determined by the past, where free will is an illusion, where everything that will ever happen is already decided, already implicit in the current state of things. Imagine the demon's knowledge as a vast table, infinitely long, listing the position and velocity of every particle, every electron, every quark, every photon, trillions upon trillions upon trillions of entries, and the demon has access to all this information perfectly, knows it exactly, with infinite precision. And the demon also knows Newton's laws, or perhaps Einstein's field equations, or quantum mechanics, knows the rules that govern how these particles influence each other, how forces propagate, how energy transfers, and with this knowledge, the demon can simulate the universe, can run the equations forward in time, calculating step by step how the particles will move, how they will collide and interact, and the simulation produces a prediction, a complete specification of the universe at every future moment. And this prediction, if the laws of physics are deterministic, is not probabilistic but certain. The future is determined, fixed, inevitable, and the demon knows it all. The implications are profound and troubling, because if Laplace's demon is possible, if the universe is deterministic, then free will becomes problematic, becomes perhaps an illusion, because every decision you make, every thought you have, every action you take is the result of particles in your brain following physical laws, and those particles are moving according to rules determined by their initial conditions, and those initial conditions were set by earlier states, going back to the beginning of the universe. And so your choices are not free but predetermined, decided billions of years ago when the universe began, and you are not an agent but an automaton, a complex machine that operates according to fixed rules, and the feeling of making choices, of deliberating and deciding, is a subjective experience produced by computational processes in your brain. But the outcome was never in doubt, was determined from the start, and this conclusion undermines moral responsibility, undermines the concepts of praise and blame, undermines the notion that people could have done otherwise, and it raises the question of what it means to be human if our actions are all predetermined. But Laplace's demon faces several obstacles, several reasons why even in principle it might be impossible. The first obstacle is quantum mechanics, which was unknown in Laplace's time, but is now recognized as fundamental to physics, and quantum mechanics is probabilistic, not deterministic. The Heisenberg uncertainty principle states that we cannot know both the position and velocity of a particle with perfect precision. There is an irreducible indeterminacy, a fundamental limit on what can be known, and when we measure a quantum system, the outcome is random, governed by probabilities but not determined. And so Laplace's demon cannot have the precise initial conditions it needs, cannot know the exact state of the universe, and even if it could, the laws of quantum mechanics only predict probabilities for future events, not certainties. And so the future is genuinely open, not determined, and Laplace's demon is impossible. The second obstacle is chaos sensitivity to initial conditions, where tiny unmeasurable differences in starting states lead to vastly different outcomes over time. Weather systems, planetary orbits, fluid flows, all exhibit chaotic behavior, where prediction becomes impossible beyond a certain time horizon, because errors in measurement, no matter how small, grow exponentially and eventually dominate. And even if quantum mechanics were not an issue, even in a classical deterministic universe, practical prediction would be impossible for chaotic systems, and the demon would need infinite precision, infinitely accurate knowledge of initial conditions, and any finite approximation, no matter how good, would fail after sufficient time. And so the demon's predictions would be useless for complex systems on long timescales. The third obstacle is computational. Even if the demon had perfect information and deterministic laws, simulating the universe requires computing power, requires processing the interactions of every particle, and the universe contains roughly 10 to the 80 particles, and computing their evolution requires resources, and some physicists have argued that simulating the universe would require a computer as large as the universe itself, and such a computer could not run faster than the universe it simulates, could not predict the future faster than the future unfolds, and so the demon could not tell you tomorrow's events before tomorrow arrives, and the demon becomes useless as a predictor, reduced to a mere recorder that reconstructs what has already happened rather than foretelling what will happen. Visualize the universe as a vast machine, gears turning, particles moving, and Laplace's demon standing outside, watching the machine, knowing the position of every gear, the velocity of every component, and calculating how the machine will continue to turn. But the demon is blocked by quantum uncertainty, cannot measure the gears precisely enough, is blocked by chaos, cannot maintain accuracy over time, is blocked by computational limits, cannot perform the calculation fast enough. And so the demon, mighty as it seems, is impossible. The universe resists total prediction, resists complete knowledge, not because of practical limitations, but because of fundamental features of physical law and determinism. Even if it were true, does not grant us the power to predict. And the demon remains a thought experiment, a symbol of a kind of knowledge that cannot exist, a vision of omniscience that is ruled out by the nature of reality itself. Laplace's demon also raises philosophical questions about explanation and understanding, because even if we cannot predict the future, even if determinism fails or the demon is impossible, we still seek to explain why things happen, to trace causes and effects, to understand the mechanisms that generate events. And this explanatory project does not require Laplacian determinism, does not require perfect prediction, but only patterns, regularities, laws that hold approximately, and science proceeds without the demon, without omniscience, by finding partial explanations, probabilistic models, statistical regularities, and these are sufficient for understanding, for technology, for navigating the world. And the demon's impossibility does not doom science but liberates it, frees it from the burden of total prediction, allows it to focus on what can be known rather than lamenting what cannot. The demon sits in conceptual space, all-knowing and impotent, knowing everything but unable to act, unable to exist, blocked by uncertainty, by chaos, by computation, and Laplace's vision of a deterministic clockwork universe fades, replaced by a more subtle picture, a universe governed by laws but not wholly determined, open to chance, to randomness, to emergence, where the future is not written in the present but unfolds through processes that are partly lawful and partly random, and free will, though not proven, is at least not obviously refuted, and moral responsibility, though challenged, survives because even if determinism were true, even if all actions are caused by prior states, we still distinguish between actions that flow from deliberation and those that do not, between agents who respond to reasons and those who do not, and these distinctions matter, ground our practices of praise and blame, and Laplace's demon, impossible and paradoxical, remains a touchstone in debates about determinism, free will, and the limits of knowledge, a thought experiment that has shaped centuries of discussion and continues to challenge our understanding of what it means to predict, to know, and to be free. McTaggart's paradox of time, why past, present, and future are contradictory. A philosopher named J.M.E. McTaggart constructs an argument attempting to prove that time is unreal, that temporal distinctions are contradictory, that past, present, and future cannot coexist, and the argument begins by distinguishing two ways of thinking about time: the A series, which orders events as past, present, or future, and the B series, which orders events as earlier than or later than each other. And McTaggart argues that the A series is essential to time, that change requires events to move from future to present to past, that without this passage, without the A series, there is no real time. But the A series is contradictory, generates logical problems, and therefore time is unreal, is an appearance generated by our temporal perspective, but does not correspond to ultimate reality. And this is McTaggart's paradox of time, one of the most famous and most controversial arguments in the philosophy of time, an argument that has shaped all subsequent debates about the nature of time, about whether time is real or illusory, about whether the passage of time is objective or subjective. Imagine time as having two aspects: the A series aspect, where events are classified as past, present, or future, where we say the meeting is future, is happening now in the present, was past yesterday, and events change their A series position, move from future to present to past, and this movement is time's passage, is what makes time dynamic. And the B series aspect, where events are ordered as earlier or later, where we say the meeting is later than breakfast and earlier than dinner, and these B series relations are fixed, do not change. The meeting is always later than breakfast, regardless of when we consider it. And McTaggart argues that the A series is essential for real time, that the B series alone is not sufficient, that time requires passage, requires events to change from future to present to past, but the A series is contradictory, and so time is impossible, is unreal. The paradox emerges from the fact that A series properties are contradictory. Every event is past and present and future. The meeting is future before it occurs, is present when it occurs, is past after it occurs. And so the meeting has all three properties, is past and present and future. And these properties are incompatible, cannot all be instantiated by the same event. And so the A series generates contradiction. And the standard response is to say that events have A series properties at different times. The meeting is future at earlier times, present at its time of occurrence, past at later times. And this seems to resolve the contradiction by indexing A series properties to times. But McTaggart argues this does not help, because now we must ask whether the times themselves are past, present, or future. And the same problem recurs. If the time at which the meeting is future is itself past, then the meeting is past and future, and contradiction remains. And indexing to times does not eliminate the contradiction, but only pushes it back. McTaggart argues that the only way to avoid contradiction is to eliminate the A series, to accept that events do not really move from future to present to past. That passage is illusory, that reality consists only of the B series, only of earlier-later relations. But the B series without the A series is not real time, is only a static ordering, lacks the dynamism, lacks the passage that is essential to time. And so time is unreal, is an appearance that our consciousness generates from a fundamentally timeless reality. And McTaggart's position is a form of idealism about time, treats time as mind-dependent, as not part of the ultimate structure of reality. Visualize the paradox as a vicious circle. Events have A series properties, but these properties are contradictory. So we index them to times, but then times have A series properties, which are contradictory. So we index to second-order times, but these are contradictory, and the regress continues. And the contradiction is never eliminated, only relocated. And McTaggart concludes that the A series is inherently contradictory, cannot be made coherent, and must be rejected. And with it goes time itself, which requires the A series for its reality. One response to McTaggart's paradox, the tenseless or B theory response, accepts McTaggart's argument that the A series is contradictory, but denies that time requires the A series, argues that the B series is sufficient for real time, that earlier-later relations constitute time, and passage is an illusion, is a feature of our temporal perspective, and the universe exists as a four-dimensional block, a block universe where all times are equally real, and past, present, and future are not objective features of reality, but are indexical, are relative to a perspective, and this B theory has become orthodoxy in philosophy of time, is widely accepted as avoiding McTaggart's paradox while preserving the reality of time. Another response, the tensed or A-theory response, denies that the A-series is contradictory, argues that McTaggart's argument involves a mistake, that A-series properties are not really contradictory because they are indexed to times in a non-problematic way, and the meeting being future at T1 and past at T2 is not contradictory, is just the normal way temporal properties work. And A-theorists argue that passage is real, that the present is objectively real, that the future is open and the past is fixed. And McTaggart's argument fails because it assumes that A-series properties must be simultaneous to be contradictory when they are not simultaneous, are at different times, and this response preserves the A-series, preserves passage, and rejects McTaggart's conclusion that time is unreal. A third response from presentism argues that only the present exists, that past and future are unreal, and so events do not have contradictory A-series properties because only present events exist, and only present properties are real, and the meeting is not simultaneously past, present, and future because only one of these is real at any time. And presentism avoids McTaggart's paradox by radical ontological restriction, by accepting that most of time does not exist, and this preserves the reality of the present, preserves passage, but faces difficulties explaining how truths about past and future can be true if past and future do not exist. McTaggart's paradox has been enormously influential, has shaped all debates about time, has forced philosophers to clarify their positions, to distinguish A theories from B theories, to recognize that different conceptions of time have different metaphysical commitments, and the paradox remains controversial, remains debated, with some accepting McTaggart's conclusion that time is unreal, some accepting that the A series is contradictory, but denying that this makes time unreal, and some denying that the A series is contradictory, and no consensus exists, and the paradox endures as one of the most important arguments in metaphysics, an argument that challenges our ordinary understanding of time, forces recognition that temporal passage, the movement from future through present to past, is philosophically problematic, and whether time is real or illusory remains one of philosophy's deepest questions, and McTaggart's paradox continues to structure the debate, continues to force philosophers to grapple with the nature of time, with whether passage is objective or subjective, with whether reality is a static four-dimensional block or a dynamic unfolding present, and the paradox persists, unsolved and perhaps unsolvable, a permanent challenge to theories of time. Morton's Fork, when both choices lead to the same doom. A tax collector in 15th century England faces a dilemma when assessing how much wealthy citizens should pay, and the collector observes that some nobles live extravagantly, displaying their wealth openly, and others live frugally, claiming poverty. And Archbishop John Morton, serving as Lord Chancellor under King Henry VII, devises a strategy to extract taxes regardless of which lifestyle the noble chooses, and the strategy is simple and brutal. If a noble lives extravagantly, then clearly they have money and can afford to pay high taxes. And if a noble lives frugally, then clearly they are saving money and must have accumulated wealth and can afford to pay high taxes. And either way, the noble must pay. There is no escape, no strategy that avoids taxation. And this trap, where two apparently opposite choices lead to the same unwanted outcome, became known as Morton's Fork, named after the archbishop who wielded it. And the term has entered common usage to describe any situation where someone must choose between two options that both lead to the same undesirable result, where the appearance of choice masks the reality of inevitability. Imagine being a noble in Morton's England, weighing your options, trying to decide whether to live well or live simply, and realizing that either choice leads to heavy taxation, that the tax collector has closed off all escape routes, has constructed a logical trap where your strategy is irrelevant, where you lose regardless of what you choose. And this creates a sense of futility, a recognition that the game is rigged, that the appearance of agency is illusory. And Morton's Fork exemplifies a class of situations where apparent choices are not genuine choices, where different paths converge on the same destination, and the only real choice is whether to accept the inevitable or to refuse to play the game at all. The structure of Morton's Fork appears throughout logic, rhetoric, and strategy. Wherever someone constructs an argument that covers all cases, that shows that regardless of what premises are accepted, a certain conclusion follows, and such arguments can be powerful tools of persuasion, can trap opponents in positions where they cannot escape the conclusion, but they can also be fallacious, can hide implicit assumptions or false dichotomies, can present apparent inevitability that dissolves under scrutiny. And distinguishing genuine Morton's Forks from apparent ones requires careful analysis of whether the two paths really do lead to the same conclusion, or whether there are hidden differences, hidden escape routes. Visualize the fork as a Y-shaped path, two branches diverging, one path representing extravagance and one representing frugality, and both paths lead to the same destination. The tax collector's office and the noble walking either path arrives at the same place. And the fork is not a choice between outcomes, but a choice between routes to a predetermined outcome. And the futility comes from recognizing that movement, that action, that strategy, all are pointless, all lead to the same end, and the only way to avoid the destination is to refuse to walk, to opt out of the entire framework. Morton's Fork differs from a dilemma, where two choices lead to different, undesirable outcomes, and the chooser must select the lesser evil, because in Morton's Fork, the outcomes are the same, are equally bad, and the choice is between different routes to that bad outcome. And this makes Morton's Fork particularly frustrating, particularly demoralizing, because at least in a dilemma there is a meaningful choice, a decision that matters, but in Morton's Fork the choice does not matter. The outcome is fixed, and the appearance of choice is a cruel illusion. The concept has applications in game theory, in situations where a player's strategies are dominated, where regardless of what the player does, the outcome is worse than some alternative the player cannot access, and recognizing Morton's Forks is important for strategic reasoning, for understanding when continued play is pointless, when the game should be abandoned rather than played, because playing only wastes resources without changing the outcome. Morton's Fork also appears in legal and political contexts, where laws or policies are designed to be inescapable, where any action a person takes falls under the law's scope, and this can be legitimate, can reflect comprehensive regulation of a domain, but it can also be oppressive, can create situations where individuals have no legal way to avoid a burden, no option but compliance, and recognizing such structures is important for identifying injustice, for understanding when law has become a trap rather than a framework for freedom. The paradox also has psychological dimensions, because facing Morton's Fork creates learned helplessness, creates the sense that choices do not matter, that outcomes are predetermined regardless of effort or strategy, and this can lead to resignation, to ceasing to resist, to accepting the inevitable, and oppressive systems often work by creating Morton's Forks, by ensuring that resistance and compliance lead to similar outcomes, that fighting and surrendering are equally futile, and breaking out of Morton's Fork requires either finding a hidden third option, a way to refuse the binary choice, or accepting one path and finding meaning in the choosing, even if the outcome is fixed. Some philosophers argue that life itself is Morton's Fork, that all paths lead to death, that whether we live virtuously or wickedly, happily or miserably, we end up in the same place, non-existent, and this can be a source of nihilism, can undermine the sense that choices matter, but it can also be liberating, can free us to choose based on values rather than outcomes. To recognize that if all paths lead to death, then what matters is the path itself, the journey, not the destination, and Morton's Fork becomes an invitation to find meaning in process rather than result. The Archbishop's strategy was effective, was brutal, extracted taxes efficiently, and the nobles paid, unable to escape the logic, unable to find a strategy that avoided the fork. And Morton's Fork entered history, became a term of art, became a warning about inescapable traps, about situations where apparent choice conceals actual constraint, and the fork remains present in contemporary debates about policy, law, and strategy. A reminder that not all choices are meaningful, that sometimes the appearance of freedom masks the reality of compulsion, and that recognizing Morton's Fork is the first step toward escaping it, toward finding the third option, the refusal to engage, the rejection of the binary. And the fork stands, points in two directions, both leading to the same place, and the challenge is to see the fork for what it is, to recognize when choice is illusory, when strategy is futile, and when the only real option is to walk away, to refuse the fork entirely, to create a new path that the fork's designer did not anticipate. And Morton's Fork remains a timeless trap, a logical structure that appears whenever someone seeks to eliminate all escape routes, to ensure that whatever choice is made, the desired outcome follows. And the fork endures as a reminder that the appearance of choice can be deceptive, that freedom requires more than options, requires that options lead to genuinely different outcomes, and that when options converge, when the fork's prongs meet, choice becomes meaningless, and only opting out restores agency. Parfit's teletransportation paradox. Imagine a future where technology allows instant travel across vast distances through a process called teletransportation. A device scans your body down to the atomic level, recording the exact position and state of every particle, and then transmits this information to a distant location where another device reconstructs you perfectly, assembling a body atom by atom according to the transmitted blueprint. And the reconstruction is flawless, every memory intact, every scar reproduced, every thought continued, and the reconstructed person steps out of the receiving chamber, believing themselves to be you, feeling no discontinuity, no sense that anything strange has occurred. The philosopher Derek Parfit asked a disturbing question about this process. Are you the person who steps out of the receiving chamber, or did you die in the scanning chamber? And a copy, a duplicate with all your memories and personality, is now living your life. And if the scanning process destroys the original body as it records the information, then perhaps it is still you, continuous in some sense, but what if the original body is not destroyed? What if the scanner leaves you standing in the departure chamber, intact and alive, while the reconstruction appears in the receiving chamber? And now there are two of you, both with equal claim to being the original, both feeling that they are you, and if both are you, then identity has become plural. But if only one is you, then which one and what criterion could possibly distinguish them when they are physically and psychologically identical? Parfit used this thought experiment to challenge the intuition that personal identity is what matters in survival, arguing that what matters is not identity, not being numerically the same person, but rather psychological continuity and connectedness, the preservation of memories, personality, beliefs, desires, and ongoing projects. And if these are preserved, then survival has occurred even if strict identity has not. And so, the reconstructed person is you in every way that matters, even if they are not numerically identical to the original you. And the question of whether identity is preserved is a question about what we care about rather than a deep metaphysical fact. The paradox becomes more troubling when variations are introduced. Suppose the teletransportation device malfunctions and creates not one, but two reconstructions, both perfect, both claiming to be you, and now identity must branch. which seems impossible because identity is supposed to be a one-to-one relation. A thing is identical only to itself, and yet both reconstructions have an equal claim. And if identity is not preserved in this case, then why should it be preserved in the normal case where only one reconstruction appears? And if it is not preserved, then every time you use the teletransporter, you die, and a new person with your memories takes your place, living a life they falsely believe is a continuation of yours. Parfit embraced the conclusion that identity is not what matters, that we should care about psychological continuity rather than numerical identity, and that the concept of a persisting self, a single unified person who endures over time, is less important than we ordinarily think. That what makes your future self matter to you now is not that they are literally the same person, but that they are psychologically connected to you in the right ways, and if those connections can branch or spread across multiple individuals, then so be it. Identity is not sacred, not the ultimate ground of value or concern. The teletransportation paradox has implications for how we think about personal survival, about whether what matters in death is the cessation of psychological continuity or the cessation of biological life, about whether uploading consciousness to a computer or creating digital copies would constitute survival or merely the creation of simulacra, and about whether the self is a metaphysical entity or a convenient fiction we use to organize experience. The paradox also challenges intuitions about moral responsibility, because if identity is vague or plural, then questions about who is responsible for past actions or who deserves future rewards become murky, and the unity of the person, which underpins much of ethics and law, begins to dissolve. Parfit's teletransportation scenario remains one of the most powerful thought experiments in philosophy, a story that uses imaginable technology to expose deep questions about identity, survival, and what it means to be a person, forcing recognition that the boundaries of the self, like the boundaries of clouds and cats, may be far less clear and far less important than common sense suggests, and that the question of whether you survive. Teletransportation may have no determinate answer, or many answers, or may simply be the wrong question to ask. Schrödinger's cat, the pet that's both alive and dead. A cat sits in a sealed box, a box that cannot be opened or observed from the outside. And inside the box with the cat is a device, a quantum mechanism that has a 50% chance of killing the cat within 1 hour and a 50% chance of leaving the cat alive. Perhaps a vial of poison that will break if a single radioactive atom decays. And the decay is a quantum event, genuinely random, with no way to predict whether it will happen in the next hour. And so after 1 hour has passed, the cat is either alive or dead. 50-50 odds. And this seems straightforward, but the paradox emerges when quantum mechanics is taken seriously, when the rules of quantum theory are applied consistently, because quantum mechanics says that before a measurement is made, before the box is opened and the cat is observed, the system exists in a superposition, a combination of both possible states simultaneously. And so the cat is both alive and dead at the same time, existing in a strange limbo where neither state is definite until observation collapses the superposition and forces the system into one state or the other. And this is Schrödinger's cat, a thought experiment devised by physicist Erwin Schrödinger in 1935 to illustrate what he saw as the absurdity of applying quantum mechanics to macroscopic objects to show that something was wrong with the standard interpretation of quantum theory. Imagine the situation step by step. At the beginning, the cat is alive, the radioactive atom has not yet decayed, and the quantum state is well defined. But as time passes, the atom enters a superposition of decayed and not decayed, because quantum mechanics describes it with a wave function that assigns amplitudes to both possibilities, and these amplitudes evolve smoothly, and the atom is in a state of quantum indeterminacy. neither definitely decayed nor definitely not decayed, until a measurement is made. And this indeterminacy is not ignorance, not a matter of the atom being in one state or the other, and we just do not know which, but a genuine feature of quantum reality. The atom literally does not have a definite state until measured. And because the poison release is coupled to the atom's state, the poison is both released and not released, and the cat is both dead and alive, existing in a superposition of macroscopic states. And this conclusion seems absurd, seems to violate everything we know about cats and boxes and life and death, and Schrödinger intended it to be absurd, to show that something must be wrong with the orthodox interpretation of quantum mechanics, that the theory cannot be applied consistently to large objects, that there must be a boundary somewhere between the quantum realm, where superpositions occur, and the classical realm, where objects have definite states. The paradox has generated an enormous amount of discussion and debate in physics and philosophy, with different interpretations of quantum mechanics offering different resolutions. The Copenhagen interpretation, the dominant view in Schrödinger's time, says that the wave function collapses upon measurement, that the act of observation forces the system into one definite state. And so when the box is opened and the cat is observed, the superposition collapses and the cat becomes definitely alive or definitely dead. But this raises questions about what counts as a measurement, about what constitutes an observer, about whether consciousness is required to collapse the wave function, or whether any physical interaction suffices. And these questions remain controversial, and the Copenhagen interpretation does not provide clear answers, does not specify where the quantum classical boundary lies. The many worlds interpretation offers a different resolution, saying that the wave function never collapses, that both outcomes occur, that the universe splits into two branches, one where the cat is alive and one where the cat is dead, and both branches are equally real. And the observer also splits, becoming two versions, one observing a live cat and one observing a dead cat. And each version believes they have observed a definite outcome. But from a global perspective, both outcomes happen. And the superposition is resolved not by collapse but by branching. And this interpretation avoids the measurement problem, avoids the need to specify what counts as a measurement. But it introduces other difficulties: the proliferation of parallel worlds, the question of what it means for both outcomes to be real, and whether this is a genuine solution or merely a reformulation of the problem. Decoherence theory provides another perspective, focusing on the interaction between the quantum system and its environment, and it shows that macroscopic objects, like cats, are constantly interacting with their surroundings, with air molecules, with photons, with thermal radiation, and these interactions cause the quantum coherence, the delicate phase relationships that allow superpositions to be destroyed very rapidly in a fraction of a second for macroscopic objects. And once coherence is lost, the system behaves classically, appears to be in one definite state, and so the cat never actually exists in a superposition of alive and dead, or exists in such a state for only an immeasurably short time before decoherence converts it to a classical mixture, a probabilistic state where the cat is either alive or dead. We just do not know which until we look. And this dissolves the paradox by denying that macroscopic superpositions persist long enough to be observable. The paradox also raises questions about the role of consciousness in quantum mechanics, about whether an observer must be conscious to collapse the wave function, and some interpretations suggest that consciousness plays a special role, that the cat remains in superposition until a conscious being opens the box and perceives the outcome. And this view has been criticized as mystical, as importing mind into physics in ways that are unnecessary and unhelpful, and most physicists reject it, preferring interpretations that treat measurement as a physical process involving interactions with macroscopic devices not requiring consciousness. But the question remains open, debated, unresolved, and Schrödinger's cat sits at the center of this debate, a symbol of the deep puzzles that quantum mechanics presents. Visualize the box, sealed and opaque, and inside the cat waits, and the quantum device ticks, and the atom hovers in superposition. And according to quantum mechanics, the entire contents of the box, the atom, the device, the poison, the cat, all exist in a superposition of two macroscopically distinct states: alive, cat no decay, and dead cat decay. And this superposition is described by a wave function that smoothly evolves. And the two branches of the wave function correspond to two different realities. And yet before the box is opened, there is only one box, one cat, one system. And the paradox is that quantum mechanics seems to say the cat is both alive and dead. While common sense says the cat is either alive or dead, we just do not know which. And this clash between quantum formalism and classical intuition is the heart of Schrödinger's cat, a paradox that has no agreed upon solution, that different interpretations resolve in different ways, and that continues to drive research in the foundations of quantum mechanics. In efforts to understand what measurement means, what quantum states represent, and how the quantum world relates to the classical world we experience, the box sits on the table, the hour passes, and the cat's fate is sealed. Or is it? Or is the cat in limbo, suspended between life and death, waiting for observation to make reality definite? And the paradox endures, not because physicists do not understand quantum mechanics, but because quantum mechanics, understood correctly, leads to conclusions that seem impossible, that violate everyday experience, that force choices between interpretations that are empirically equivalent but conceptually divergent. And Schrödinger's cat remains the most famous illustration of this strangeness, a thought experiment that has entered popular culture, a paradox that symbolizes the weirdness of quantum reality. And the cat, alive and dead, real and hypothetical, continues to haunt physics and philosophy, a permanent reminder that the quantum world is not merely different in degree from the classical world, but different in kind, governed by rules that defy visualization and resist intuitive understanding. And the paradox persists, unresolved in the deepest sense, a puzzle that reveals the limits of human intuition and the challenge of making sense of a theory that works perfectly in practice but remains mysterious in principle. The Achilles and the tortoise. Achilles, the swift-footed hero of Greek legend, agrees to race a tortoise, and to make the contest fair, the tortoise is given a head start, perhaps 100 meters, and the race begins, and Achilles runs swiftly toward the point where the tortoise started. But by the time he reaches that point, the tortoise has moved forward a small distance, perhaps 10 meters, and so Achilles runs toward that new position. But again, by the time he arrives, the tortoise has advanced a bit further, perhaps 1 meter, and this process continues. Each time Achilles reaches where the tortoise was, the tortoise has moved ahead. And it seems that Achilles can never quite catch up, never quite overtake the slower creature. And yet common sense insists that, of course, Achilles will pass the tortoise. That speed wins races, that the faster runner always overtakes the slower, given enough time and distance. And this contradiction between logic and intuition is Zeno's most famous paradox, a puzzle that has captivated philosophers and mathematicians for over 2 millennia. Zeno of Elea constructed this argument in the 5th century BCE as part of his defense of Parmenidean monism, the idea that reality is one unchanging whole and that motion and plurality are illusions. And the paradox was meant to show that the concept of motion leads to absurdity, that if we accept that space and time can be divided infinitely, then the faster can never overtake the slower. And since this conclusion is obviously false, something must be wrong with our assumptions about motion and change. The paradox rests on the idea that Achilles must complete infinitely many tasks, reaching the first point where the tortoise was, then the second, then the third, and so on without end. And if each task takes some amount of time, however small, then infinitely many tasks would require infinite time. And yet in reality, Achilles catches and passes the tortoise in a finite time. And so where is the error? Aristotle argued that the paradox confuses potential and actual infinity, that while the path can be divided into infinitely many segments in thought, Achilles does not actually perform infinitely many separate actions. He simply runs, continuously and smoothly. And the infinite division is an artifact of analysis, not a feature of the motion itself. The resolution became clearer with the development of calculus, which showed that an infinite series of diminishing intervals can sum to a finite total, that 1 + 1/10 + 100th, and so on converges to a specific finite value. And so the infinite number of time intervals Achilles requires to reach each successive position also sum to a finite time, the time it takes him to overtake the tortoise. Yet the paradox retains a strange power, a sense that something about infinity remains counterintuitive, that the idea of completing an infinite number of steps feels impossible, even when mathematics insists it is not, and philosophers continue to debate whether the mathematical resolution truly captures the conceptual problem or merely sidesteps it. The paradox also connects to questions about the nature of space and time, whether they are continuous or discrete, whether motion is genuinely smooth or composed of tiny jumps, whether there is a smallest possible distance or duration beyond which reality cannot be divided. And these questions remain open in modern physics, where quantum mechanics and theories of spacetime suggest that the classical picture of smooth continuous motion may break down at the smallest scales. If you enjoy these explorations of paradox and the limits of thought, consider subscribing so you never miss a journey into philosophy's most perplexing puzzles, and perhaps leave a comment sharing where you are in the world as you listen to these ideas unfold. Achilles and the tortoise remain locked in their eternal race, a metaphor for the human attempt to reconcile the finite with the infinite, the continuous with the discrete, the logical with the intuitive. And the paradox endures as a reminder that even the simplest motion, a hero chasing a tortoise, conceals within it mysteries that have not been fully solved. Questions that linger at the boundary where mathematics meets reality, where reason meets experience, where what must be true, according to logic, clashes with what obviously is true, according to the world.